So, welcome everyone to our third PhDebates session already. Today we have three speakers who all are going to talk about virtual archaeology and whether this is a tool or a toy in archaeology. We have Tijm Lanjouw, who's going to present first, and then Aris Politopoulos and Phil Poscherion, who will be the last, I guess. So we have an hour of presentations on this topic, then a short break, and then afterwards we have discussion again about it. Yeah, so welcome everyone, please enjoy.
Okay, so my name is Tijm Lanjouw. For those who don't know me, I work in they are doing their project Consolidating Empire, analysis of the site of Tel Sabi Abiad. And because of my work, because I use 3D modeling in my work, I got interested in virtual archaeology, and for that reason I'm giving sort of the introductory talk to this day, to give you also sort of a good basis for a discussion in the second hour. So my point of view is going to be historical, and that's what I'm going to do. So when we think of the question, a tool or a toy, you could wonder, why are we asking this? Why aren't we asking, for example, geographic information systems, a tool or a toy? Or the total station, a tool or a toy? Or even the trowel, a tool or a toy? It's sort of the statement, a tool or a toy, or they sort of questions the scientific value of the tool we are using here. It has some kind of skepticism underlying it, and so in my talk today, I'm going to look into the history of virtual archaeology and look into the history also of the skepticism towards virtual archaeology, towards virtual visualization techniques, towards 3D modeling, and show you why we are asking this question. So, a couple of questions I want to get answered today is, what is virtual archaeology? Why did archaeologists start using virtual technology in order to assist their research? How have they understood the term, and how have they applied it then? Specifically as a tool for scientific discovery, and I will give concrete examples. And then I will talk about, during this talk, about the origins of this skepticism that was present in the statement of this question. So, let's take a look at the origin of virtual archaeology and go through its historical development. So, virtual archaeology, of course, refers to the term virtual reality, which has its origins in the 60s, first virtual reality system. Get the opportunity to sort of define it based on the Wikipedia definition. Virtual reality can be referred as an immersive multimedia or computer simulated life, replicates an environment that simulates physical presence in places in the real world or imagined worlds. Virtual reality can recreate sensory experiences which include virtual taste, sight, smell, sound, and touch. And this is sort of also my common sense definition that I used when I thought about this day and asked the other talks, Aris, to talk about the role of gaming in archaeology, and talk about simulating the role of simulation in archaeology, because we are all creating a virtual world in order to experiment with it, experiment with our data, and simulate certain properties of the real world. In my case, I'm using 3D modeling, and I simulate basically the geometric behavior of shapes in order to understand my object of research better. So it's all virtual worlds. So in archaeology, we can go back even to the 70s to Leo Beek, who introduced a system. And I was going to say virtual archaeology is not new, it started in the 70s. He experimented with a system called Learny in this ancient monuments laboratory. And they used all kinds of technology in a very simple way, but already like precursors of what we do nowadays. To the right you see photogrammetry, really stereo photogrammetry, two photos next to each other. Nowadays we do it with lots more photos, but basically the idea was there. 1981, TV digitized different elements, digitizing analog or just objects in order to put them in a virtual system, in order to analyze them further. He made a small, like a computer program for how to animate sequences, that kind of things. So and he wanted to combine all this different data and all these different methods in one system in order to enable the archaeologists to understand their archaeology better, to be able to enable the archaeologists to learn better. Therefore, the name Learny. I don't remember what it exactly stands for. And they even had already, he refers to this, a three-dimensional model of Stonehenge in the 70s, even though when I will go to the next historical fact, oh wait, I will first go to introduction of the term virtual reality, was by computer scientist Jaron Lanier in 1979. For archaeology important, in the early 80s started actual making 3D models of objects and this kind of things. In the mid 80s we can see the first 3D models of historical buildings. These are some examples of this. The left up is, as far as I know, the first 3D model. A 3D reconstruction model of the temple precinct of Roman Bath. And there's another model on the right, 1980s, date to 1987. So in the mid 80s, we got that already? Yeah, okay, cool. In 1990 then, we get the birth of the term virtual archaeology. It's by archaeologist Paul Riley, who was involved in these 80s 3D projects. And he introduced this term in this article. And he imagined virtual archaeology to be like, by constructing detailed models of excavation material, archaeologists can re-excavate the site and search for evidence which escaped attention during the actual dig. So he imagines like this 3D modeling, getting all the data of an excavation already in like in 1990, in the 80s. He thinks of like a system that contains all this data and is modeled while you are also excavating. And in this interaction between the modeling and the excavation, new questions arise. And therefore it will create sort of scientific value. An example in the same publication that Riley published in, this is some computer simulated site, Clonehenge, experimented with different visualizations, 3D visualizations, that kind of things, to see what they could do with this in order to help their understanding of these sites. So for virtual archaeology, so the internet was very important as a development in the early 90s. In 1994, something we're still using, VRML, virtual reality modeling language, that enabled people that make VR models to publish them online and show them in your browser. So and very quickly after that you get the first visualization of an archaeological site in VR using VRML, virtual Stonehenge. I've even found some pictures of this. This is how it looked like. Yeah. Another step forward, or at least potentially a step forward, but I was sure that it has not entirely taken up that well. Cave technology, which sort of put with a head-mounted display. There was already in 2000. Cave technology was developed in the late 90s, and also again you see archaeologists already quite early adopting it to experiment with it. Great Temple of Petra is published 2001. Head-mounted display, analyzing finds in relation to architecture, already being done like this 15 years ago. And for virtual archaeology, I think the recent sort of flow of mass photogrammetry, that our computers are able to deal with a lot of photos and to deal with that we have different ways of documenting our data and our excavations is becoming to make a big impact on archaeology nowadays. Also, the sort of drop in costs, if you compare to the 70s, where a system like that costed £2 million, in the mid-80s $1 million, and well, we go down to nowadays you can do most of these things on a €600 laptop. Okay. But there were, compared to what Riley said in the beginning, of Riley's sort of positive message he got in his 1990 article, you expect virtual archaeology to be born and everybody's going to make best profit, best use of it. But like 18 years later, we read Maurizio Forte, one of another pioneers in the field, saying the balance sheet of 20 years of archaeological research on the application of the third dimension as a research tool was fairly depressing. So he thinks the application of it has been, like, if he judges all the previous what done before 2008, completely random, completely unguided. There was no general research plan or no well thought through research goals. But so what went actually wrong here with this sort of positive start? And are things better now, 7 years later? Yeah, that's what I just said. So why did archaeologists get into virtual archaeology? What were the advantages according to Paul Riley, the inventor? He says it stimulates useful insights relevant to the theory that certain social and political relationships are reflected in the use of space within the monument. It may help to expose inconsistencies in the interpretation of features. Creating a 3D model forces the archaeologist to be explicit. We'll give an example of how that works. And he says he finds also an advantage in to set. It makes it easier to create multiple versions of the past and set two competing interpretations of archaeological traces or side by side. So this article, like 1996, I don't completely agree with Forte's sort of pessimism. He said, like, a lot of archaeologists started using it, and they started experimenting, comparing. Like, okay, we do 2D data documentation, interpretation, everything, and we do it in 3D, and let's see what we can do better in 3D and in a virtual environment. One of these projects that did that was this 1996 article about Joy Serene archaeological site in El Salvador, sort of Pompeii of the Americas, very spectacular remains, and so they got into 3D reconstructing these buildings and tried to. I've got some very bad pictures of like the article. I couldn't find a paper copy in, but this is. Yeah, well, there's some example, but what they discovered, because they were actually architects and computer scientists working together with anthropologists that worked on the site, what they discovered that in the interaction between this virtual, trying to reconstruct these buildings virtually, that a lot of the data that the archaeologists collected were wrong, or were not precise enough, or simply missing, and this kind of thing. So this is that point that Riley made, the second one, to expose inconsistencies in the interpretation of features, the explicitness of like 3D modeling in a 3D in a virtual environment, made to expose this kind of things. And they have an entire list of things how this worked in their project, and how they actually sort of understood certain spatial features between the walls and the columns that are around it. They give an example that there's a height difference that was completely ignored by the archaeologists excavating it and making 2D drawings, and then made a 3D model of it, and they realized that it had this difference in elevation was to let in light between the walls. So this kind of things that they discovered during this such a process. But if we look as a whole, as this the entire set of literature and articles that have been appearing about this, the focus has been and is often on architecture, to understand its construction, but also to test hypotheses. So to see it as an experimental platform to test hypotheses about visibility, lighting conditions, and relation to celestial bodies. It's a recent example that I really like because it's well executed. They 3D modeled houses on Akrotiri, and they related this to the architecture inside, and they tried to model the visibility of the wall paintings by a moving spectator, and they sort of mapped like how often and when certain parts of this painting could be visible to establish this sort of visual focus, which is a very nice example of combining this, so a 3D reconstruction theory about like how this building may have looked like, and then using it in order to analyze like how does this reconstruction impact, for example, the visibility of this wall painting, this fresco. And in another direction that sort of continues and that often is excluded, but I sort of see it as a part of virtual archaeology, is like the visualization of excavation data in a virtual 3D world. We're using nowadays, starting to use more and more 3D GIS. Also, this was already experimented with in the late 90s, and this is a sort of a direction that is also still being developed, and which has apparent value for archaeologists. So when sort of overlooking the entire field, there's a couple of, Jonas in 2008 written an article, Does Virtual Archaeology Exist? And classifies and defines several sort of directions that you can see, several approaches in virtual archaeology. And then what we've been discussing until now, these examples that I showed, they fall into the third category, like empiricist perspectives. They see virtual archaeology as an experimental tool for visualization, data analysis, and hypothesis verification. I will get back to the other points later. This one. But sometimes the advantage is clear, but sort of reading all these earlier examples of uses of virtual archaeology, of 3D visualization, of 3D modeling, I often got the impression like, is this really sort of this understanding, this improved understanding, does it really come from the fact that we do it in the virtual world or not? And maybe I run the risk of being a little bit too deconstructive sometimes and a bit too skeptical, but we should always question the value of these techniques. So, for example, this is an early example of a 3D model of a tell excavation in northern Greece, and they say that it helped them to understand the stepped nature of the site, the terraced nature of the site. And what I was thinking directly when I read it, like, yeah, well, if you just made a good drawing of this site and you measured everything, could you not also do the same thing? It does not necessarily come directly forward out of using a digital technique in a virtual world, but it was a handy tool. Still, it's not the only way to understand this site. Another thing that is very often used for is like comparing or testing different hypotheses, which is, again, I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm doing like constructional hypothesis about an archaeological site, about the building, how things look like. It's pretty useful. And it is often emphasized by these authors, like, okay, we can only do this with three-dimensional technology. This is a big advantage over traditional 2D technology. But for example, can we only understand Roman roofs and Pompeii with three-dimensional modeling in the virtual world? It may or may not be. It is, again, it's a useful tool, but sometimes it can also be, I think it can be done in 2D as well. But we can discuss this kind of issue, because it's very hard to test this kind of statements, because usually they only did it in one way, and not like two independent groups of researchers having the same question, and then one is only allowed to use two-dimensional visualization techniques and the other one only three-dimensional, and then see which has the best conclusions. No one ever did that. And also, for example, the use of this of the cave virtual reality technology in order to understand this great temple of Petra. They did do some testing, like ask archaeologists, do you think this is useful? Do you think you find things that you would otherwise have missed? So they had some archaeologists, and they said, like, yeah, I could see patterns in finds, concentration of land finds that I would otherwise not have seen. But again, we get the same statement. Would you need to have a cave environment to see these patterns? Could you do also the same in a two-dimensional GIS, maybe? The main strong point about this thing was that it had a connected database. So the database was the advantage, that they could query and then show where these objects were. Not necessarily that they could see it in 3D and that kind of things. And one last thing before go on. So Riley's one stated advantage was VI can help to stimulate useful insights relevant to the theory that certain social and political relationships are reflected in the use of space within a monument. And they did some, like, with this model of Roman bath over the temple precinct, and they showed it to an archaeologist, and he said, yeah, it's very impressive. I can see this building towers above me. You can see, like, the power relations reflected in the monument. But with this kind of statement, I often get like, okay, we already know that Roman architecture works like this. So there's not something new, that like Roman buildings are impressive and they are often made to sort of make this imperial statement, impress the people. So then putting it in a model and then confirm, yes, it is quite impressive, is sometimes a little bit saying the obvious, I think. Okay. So as a medium for visualization, especially when you have a lot of data, virtual archaeology is pretty useful, even though I just had some examples where I had questions with, but there's many examples that we are able to work with, so we are able to conceptualize the data better and work with it more efficiently and accurately if we can see it in 3 dimensions. And we can relate this to a list of information scientists where, like, how visualization in general helps scientists to understand their data. So It may facilitate cognition of large amounts of data. It can promote the perception of unanticipated emergent properties. I will go into a little bit more detail about it later. It sometimes highlights problems in data quality. We had seen examples of this before, that the earliest experimentations in archaeology already showed this. Makes clear the relationship of large-scale, small-scale features, the spatial relationship between features, and helps to formulate hypotheses. Now I have to check where I actually am. So, yeah. Sorry. So, in many of the articles you read about it, you get this variants of these sort of advantages of using virtual archaeology being listed all over again in the introductions, as if they had to defend the position in order to use the tool. And the origin of this may be found in a fear they had, and Riley already noted in his article the current trend to regard VR or virtual archaeologies as sophisticated picture tools, because they create interesting, spectacular visualizations, illustrations of archaeological sites. So their association was with nice, sophisticated, highly advanced picture making, and that's sort of I think that's like a threat to the entire discussion about theoretical discussion about the use of virtual archaeology. And one of the good examples, an article that's always often gets cited in this context, is Miller and Richard's article, "The Good, the Bad, and the Downright Misleading Archaeological Adoption of Computer Visualization," in which they state, or they give voice to a very common fear of a lot of archaeologists and other people, apparently, that these models that could be misleading, and especially to the public. So, because of this certain skepticism evolved toward virtual archaeology, toward 3D models by a lot of archaeologists. They didn't think they could be taken serious, even though you find no article really to talk about this. You find it only in articles replying on this sort of current trend of skepticism. So what it actually took off that a lot of archaeologists started to put a lot of effort into creating reliable models, creating ways of visualizing uncertainty in their models. This kind of things ultimately led to such a thing as a London Charter for the Computer-Based Visualization of Cultural Heritage, which is sort of setting the standards for scientifically rigorous, transparent computer models of archaeological or heritage sites, really. Yeah. Another critique came from a different direction, a little bit. Mark Gillings, in several articles, already starting in 1996. He asked the question, having spent a lot of time and money on creating a model, what are the archaeologists actually using it for? And he states that virtual reality is not used to potential. He states also that there's a lack of theoretical discussion of what VR means. There's a tendency towards seeking technological sophistication. The equation between value of the model and levels of realism and accuracy achieves it. So he believes that the value of a model, like he sees a trend that everybody sees the value of a model in how good it looks, in how realistic it looks, and how accurate it looks. And is used as a sophisticated presentation tool. Yes?
Do you mean with VR, virtual reality, or do you mean AR, like
VR?
Yeah.
Yeah. In this case, it's.
This is so the technique, and not really focused on archaeology.
No, well, VR as applied in archaeology.
Right, okay.
Yeah, no, that's archaeologists are not using VR to full potential, okay, according to Mark Illings. Now, I don't completely share Mark Illings' analysis of the field. I think I showed, and I've read examples of like archaeologists using it in a way that is not geared only towards sophisticated presentation tool. We saw in the previous articles that there was a big concern about exactly these kind of things. But what he is actually replying on is that the general trend in the field in the use of virtual archaeology has been as sort of visualization of spectacular models in museums, in documentaries, in this kind of things. So this is what everybody associated with, and he is replying more, I think, on to that kind of thing than all these examples that have sort of earnestly tried to harness the power of virtual reality in order to understand archaeological questions better. But anyway, he presents it as if the entire field is corrupt and not using it to full potential, and of course he has an alternative. So this is a famous example he gives already in 1996. Also, don't be misguided by the old-looking sort of graphics. It's about the idea that behind it. So the question, okay, the Kill Gap is on Hadrian's Wall. It's a Roman watchtower, and they had a question: if a tower connected to a continuous stretch of walling was located here, what could be seen from it? He said, and he emphasizes the exercise was not driven by the desire to recreate the stretch of Hadrian's Wall, but to answer this specific question. And what they do is a step-by-step procedure. They first have a digital elevation model, and they make view sheds from the wall in order to see what is visible, what is visible from where, and then they sort of animated that as an animated GIF that's still on the internet, available on Internet Archaeology 1996, and they have even a virtual reality application can explore it. But the thing is, I feel like the question was already answered with these two-dimensional pictures of view sheds, and then they also did that. And then he says, in a way I simply don't completely understand, but maybe I'm just like thinking a little bit different or something, that this sort of thing helped them to understand it. But it remains sort of a vague statement, and so I felt like, okay, you did your view set analysis, and that sort of answered this specific question, if this was your question. But according to Mark Illings, it's a little bit later, has more of his criticism is, like he states that previous models are sterile and used to calculate figures related to economics of construction, who need mass of center of gravity to be able to experience and dwell within a building. So he goes further here. He goes also further than the example he gave himself about the Kill Gap study. There's not really lots of dwelling going around here, but he's trying to push the field further in this article, and makes this connection with post-processual theory, focusing on experience and dwelling. And he states that VR models should be seen as constructs which can never be wholly authentic, because he thinks that all the previous uses of virtual archaeology were driven by this desire to be authentic, accurate representation of the past, to make the experience more intense or something, but that they cannot be considered wholly authentic or accurately reflect a past reality. Authenticity, he says, is much about process, biography, and embeddedness, as it is about verisimilitude. So, what this suggests is that by and there's been some research on this, of some project using this sort of theory in order to explore virtual worlds. It suggests that, like, by inhabiting yourself in a virtual world, and making social connections with others living this and walking around it, you create you recreate a sort of the experience anew of living there. So and there's maybe a little bit of a better example of that of use of virtual archaeology from this angle. This is this is an example comes from Colleen Morgan's experience with rebuilding Çatalhöyük in a virtual reality application, Second Life. It was 10 years ago, quite popular. Nowadays I don't know what happened to it. So this again comes as a critique on the present use of VR in archaeology, and so she intends to rebuild parts of Çatalhöyük in virtual reality and describes her experiences doing so. So she tells, while using Çatalhöyük in Second Life, questions appeared. Light became quickly too dark to model, so in world time of the day was important to take into consideration. Or another discovery. Nondescript brown structures are very hard to distinguish from each other. How did people unfamiliar with the community identify dwellings? So these sort of questions appear while she is sort of inhabiting, dwelling, and constructing in this world. And apparently she sees them as sort of useful insights. And another one is, I know that my poor oven would not pass for the standards of even the most basic video game design, but making the oven and placing it into context, even in a virtual context, has increased my engagement with the materiality of the objects and how they might have related to each other during their use lives. As the smoke pours out of the top of the oven, I noted that not only the wall behind it would be stained, but the ceiling above and the ladder to the exit of the building. So, but my skeptical mind questions this sort of statement. So to what degree are these insights that help us to really understand past society or past behavior or this kind of things better? And to what degree are these no more than trivialities? But here we touch upon a core of issue in archaeology, because it begs for the question, what do we judge to be useful scientific insights and what not? And that very much depends, of course, on your theoretical framework. So, what about Maurizio Forte, who was so sort of lamenting the lack of application of virtual reality, or the lack of sort of guided and structured and good application, and the lack of impact it really had in archaeology. So what did he improve in 2008 to improve the status of VA? So he did not move in the direction of Gillings or Morgan, but he did something else. He actually remained close to what virtual archaeology originally intended to do, what Riley already suggested, and he tried to improve and use more improved technology to visualize archaeological excavations, in order to improve the interpretation of these. And he cites a guy named Gregory Bateson. I don't know if you know him, but he is he worked in diverse fields of science and developed a theory about learning, and he developed like different classification of learning, and he asked the question, how do minds learn? And so also Marietje Forte wants to sort of simulate an environment in which you can stimulate the brain to learn. And not just to learn, but also to learn how to learn. And apparently this is sort of the highest level of learning that you can gain in this theory of Bateson. But we're not going into that in more detail. But but he does more in order to sort of, so he uses a more advanced technology. It is completely digital. It is not anymore like in the 90s. He confronts this like naturally in the 90s it was still like digitized excavation data. He says it's now completely digital, and I am able to sort of re-excavate my entire site because he has a very meticulous documentation technique, being able to sort of using photogrammetry, being able to excavate in virtual reality layer after layer again, which he states then that makes archaeology finally a reversible. And to shake the bad taste of the past of virtual archaeology, he decides to call it new archaeology, cyber archaeology, after Bateson, who worked in cybernetics. So, the conclusions. Is the history of the application of virtual archaeology, of virtual reality in archaeology, history of frustration? It's been called recently by Paul Riley an anxiety discourse. It seems to be, if we read all the articles reflecting on this on the application of VR, but on the other hand, many projects seem to have profited already from the beginning. They've shown that virtual archaeology assists archaeologists to answer specific questions they have. But the problem is that use of VR as a multi-sensory immersive platform that it really intends to be, like virtual reality is supposed to be, to enable humanized understanding of the past, that did not completely take off. So, looking for a future application, archaeologists have found the inspiration at the science of visualization. So I showed this list before that was quoted by Bernard Fisker, 2008. And it is still relevant for us today. So I'm now purely looking at VR and virtual archaeology as a platform for visualization. So we have all these kind of things where we have already realized sort of this potential, but the second one, it can promote the perception of anticipated emergent properties. Especially in this sort of field, it proves of, I think, is a fascinating use of visualization in VR, because it invites experimentation with different modes of visualization. Everybody knows that even a simple thing as changing a color range in your symbology of your finds constellation can suddenly stimulate sudden understanding. But what is necessary, however, is that we sometimes should not ask specific questions to our data, questions we are used answering, but instead to play with our data. In other words, to use a tool as a toy. And then I have these questions for the discussions in the end. In things I'd like to know of you, like, do you use any virtual technology in your research? If so, how? If not, why not? And would you like to? Do you see the advantages of virtual archaeology? Do you think the archaeologists have not exploited VR to its full potential? Do you have any ideas about possible new avenues for research in archaeology using virtual archaeology? Please be creative, because I'm not so creative. I'd like to know your solutions and answers. Okay, that was it.